my friend Max. First of all, it seems like, if I understand correctly, the basic premise of your book is that the efforts of Resha and her team were the impetus, the single impetus, or at least the partial impetus for Himmler's complete 180-degree turn and the cessation, as you put it, of systematic murder of not just the, let's say, Hungarian Jews or Budapest Jews, but also Jews throughout the concentration camps, including Auschwitz. So, if you were to put an estimate on the amount of Jews saved because of this one woman and her support network, what number would that be?
It's kind of hyperbole to say Resha saved all the remaining Jews. She definitely played an incredibly instrumental role. Historians don't even know how many Jews survived the camp. So certainly this deal can be linked very directly from the evidence that we have from the Nuremberg testimonies of Nazis and from Rezno Kastner, the Hungarian underground leader. I can state fairly confidently that the Jews of Budapest were saved through this deal. The remaining Jews in Auschwitz were probably saved through this deal.
How many? You mean the 8,000 or more?
I mean, there was a death march with 50,000 Jews, and many of them perished, but most of them ended up in German concentration camps.
You mean the fact that the crematoriums were stopped meant that that group of 50,000 or so were saved? Whoever.
Yeah, the Jews of Bergen Belsen who ended up being liberated in April, the Jews in the remaining concentration camps who were saved by the Red Cross. So then it becomes the Red Cross, as I said. It gets very little attention, the fact that the Nazis allowed the Red Cross to be stationed inside these remaining camps. There weren't very many camps left by the spring of 1945. Most of them have been liberated, but a series of camps.
What motivated their decision to allow the Red Cross in and remain there?
Musi had connections with the Red Cross, and he, in that cable that was displayed on the screen earlier, the November 20th cable, it mentions the role of the Red Cross. So the Red Cross ends up probably because of Musi. Musi convinces Himmler to allow the Red Cross to station themselves in these camps. So not only is the Red Cross delivering relief supplies and medicines, but they end up countermanding. Hitler has ordered the two remaining major camps to be dynamited with all the Jews inside. And it's these Red Cross officials that have been stationed there because of this agreement that ends up saving them. That ends up finding help. So even Dachau was targeted for destruction. So more than 100,000 Jews, certainly, probably anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 Jews were saved through all these deals. I estimate.
So the Red Cross were there for how long were they stationed in those concentration camps?
Sometimes just weeks, but the important thing. So this gets us to Bergen Belsen. So let me get into the Bergen Belsen, because British people actually know about Bergen Belsen. Most North Americans have only heard of Bergen Belsen because that's where Anne Frank died. So, as I said, the Nazis were willing to let the Red Cross deliver food and relief supplies to every camp, every remaining camp, after these deals started to take effect. And so when the British liberated Bergen Belsen on April 15th, 1945, this was the first significant liberation in the West. It's what certainly got the most attention in the UK. They had always claimed that they had no idea. They had no idea that this camp even existed. And they had no idea that there was a humanitarian crisis in the camp. So I discovered documents, minutes of meetings between the War Refugee Board and various Roosevelt cabinet officials, showing that the Allies were very well aware of the humanitarian crisis at Bergen Belsen as far back as January. So once the Nazis allowed relief supplies to these camps, if the Red Cross had been allowed to deliver relief supplies to every remaining camp, probably most of the Jews of Bergen Belsen and Frank would have survived. Eventually, a typhoid epidemic sweeps through the Bergen Belsen and other camps, and yet, if they had had the medicine from the Red Cross, most of the people could have probably survived. So I found very disturbing evidence. So even this late in the war, the Allies were certainly aware, the world was aware of the Holocaust by this point. And, Eisenhower had always professed to be horrified by discovering what the Nazis had done in these concentration camps. I discovered the War Refugee Board, which was created because of this Rabbis March in 1943. They were furiously trying to get supplies, petrol. The Red Cross needed gasoline in order to deliver these relief supplies to the concentration camps, Bergen Belsen and others. And Eisenhower and the Supreme Allied Command refused to give them any gasoline to save these Jews. And yet, he did allow gasoline, unlimited amounts of gasoline to save POW camps. So the Nazis also allowed them to deliver relief supplies to POW camps and concentration camps with Jews. So Eisenhower lets them have as much gasoline as they need to deliver relief supplies to the soldiers, the POWs, but none. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the War Refugee Board is fighting his supply people for gas. And they just couldn't have cared less. Obviously, they cared about the military. So most of the POWs were saved from disease and starvation. And tens and tens of thousands of Jews went to their deaths because of the indifference of the Allies, even this late in the war. So it's quite shocking to see in black and white.
Do they make the argument that they felt there was a shortage of gasoline and manpower, and that somehow the POW camps, they were concerned the POW camps the efforts to save the POWs would be undermined by this effort, or they don't even make that argument because it's simply factually.
They don't even bother. Nobody cares what happens to the Jews. Even then, it's very clear from this evidence. So the thing about so when you're talking spring of 1945, they had unlimited supply lines. There was no shortage of anything by this point. They had plenty of gasoline. When they refused to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz, notoriously, which is also sort of part of this story, which I haven't got into. They did claim that they needed the planes for the war effort. Right, that was a dubious argument even then. But when they refused gasoline to deliver relief supplies to concentration camps, there's no argument. They couldn't have said with a straight face they were faced with a shortage of gasoline because they had unlimited supplies.
And this came all the way up from Eisenhower himself? Could that be demonstrated?
Yeah, it looks like Eisenhower himself refused until very late. So eventually pressure was brought to bear, and eventually the Allies allow the relief supplies to go to the camps in the last month of the war. But we're talking January. So I have evidence. I have black and white. It's in my book. I have minutes and archival documents showing that the Allies were aware of the humanitarian crisis at Bergen Belsen specifically in January. So they knew that Bergen Belsen would need food and medicine, or else there would have been a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, which is exactly what happened. And yet they never bothered. Later they would claim they didn't even know Bergen Belsen was there, which is a lie. I'm not sure if the British Army, it's still unclear whether the British, when they arrived and they said they were surprised to find Bergen Belsen, there's no evidence that the British Army was aware of this, right? This goes all the way to Washington and the Allied command.
Has Eisenhower's legacy been tarnished as a consequence, as it rightfully should, according to this very shocking and really gut-wrenching revelation?
It's certainly been tarnished in my mind, right? There's still, there's an open question about the legacy of Roosevelt. Did Roosevelt do enough to save the Jews, and there's a lot of post-war criticism of Roosevelt's role in allowing the Holocaust to happen. And that's a valid argument. It's not as black and white as it appears. But with Eisenhower and the Allies this late in the war, it just shows the continued indifference to the plight of the Jews.
Wow. Let me go back a little bit in the story once again to highlight something. First of all, the March of the Rabbis is a really exciting piece of history, I think. I wonder if there's a book that goes into the details of that particular march. And if so, can you share with us where would you recommend how we research that further?
David Wyman has written a lot about the March of the Rabbis, but the most interesting thing about the March of the Rabbis, it's quite fascinating. So I just touched briefly on Stephen Wise and the New York leadership, the Jewish leadership. So you're in the UK, but basically even the British Jewish community was taking their lead from the New York Jewish community. They were also preoccupied more in England with Zionism than the Americans were. But so we have the Sternbach cable in 1942 alerting the entire Jewish leadership is assembled. So every major Jewish organization, secular and religious, knows about the final solution in the fall of 1942. And yet most of them trust Stephen Wise, the leader, the Reform rabbi. That was the major leader of that community. He was well respected, even in Orthodox circles. And so Wise believes Roosevelt has their back and refuses to criticize Roosevelt, even as more millions of Jews die. And then this Peter Bergson, who's known as Hillel Kook, the leader of the revisionist Zionists, he is very determined to get rescue on the agenda. And he masterminds, like I said, it's an unholy alliance, because the revisionist Zionists obviously were very committed Zionists, right? They believed they had to win the war, they had to assemble a Jewish army to defeat Hitler, and then they could establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And then the Orthodox, for the most part, the ultra-Orthodox were anti-Zionist. Not all, but most. Not because they were waiting for the Mashiach to come. That's not really a big part of it. It's more that they didn't trust the secular socialist Zionist leadership, right? They knew that when the Zionists took power, it would be a secular government, and that's the major reason that the majority were anti-Zionist. But they were fiercely anti-Zionist, and yet this Zionist leader, the revisionist Zionist leader, Peter Hillel Kook, approaches the rabbis with this scheme, and they embrace it immediately. They knew they had a common enemy, Hitler. And while 95% of the Jewish community dithers and trusts Roosevelt to protect or rescue the Jews, it's this small segment of revisionist Zionists and Orthodox that decide we have to start calling for rescue. And I don't know if you can imagine the spectacle of 400 rabbis marching through the streets of Washington. So Roosevelt, as I said, he's a friend of the Jewish community. He really was. And he wasn't particularly anti-Semitic. He has Jewish friends and advisors. So the first thing he does is, when he hears that 400 rabbis are going to descend on the White House, he asks his Jewish advisors, what do I do? And they all tell him the same thing. They all say, oh, just ignore them. They don't represent the best of Judaism. Ignore them. So that's what Roosevelt does. He actually sneaks out of the White House. He claims to have other business. He refuses to meet with them. Turns out he had nothing else on that afternoon. And yet he's heeding the advice of his Jewish advisors. The Orthodox just weren't. I mean, even today, I'm a secular Jew, and I know that the attitudes of secular Jews towards Orthodox Jews, we all know what that's like. Even more so back then, there wasn't a significant power block in the Orthodox community in the 40s, and so it was easy to ignore them. And yet, Americans go to the movie theaters, and the British people go to the movie theaters a week later, and they see these 400 rabbis marching through the streets of Washington with signs demanding rescue. And for the first time, Roosevelt can't ignore it. It's an incredible turning point, and it rarely gets discussed. This role that, these Orthodox, they only believe saving a life takes precedence above all others. And I'm still firmly secular after all this, but I've gained this whole new respect for the Orthodox Jews. And I'm not happy to growing this, but it's an incredible story. It plays such a huge role, and yet even today it's still dismissed. In fact, I was told I approached a lot of his secular historians while I was researching this, and I was shocked. One of the I won't name names, but one of the most respected Holocaust historians, when he hears I'm pursuing the story, tells me, "Oh, you're not writing about Rabbi Weissmandel, are you?" And so Rabbi Weissmandel, Michael Dov Weissmandel, a Slovakian rabbi, he was instrumental in a lot of these rescue and ransom efforts. He devised the Europa plan. He actually helped devise the tractor deception that Himmler ends up falling for. And yet he survives Auschwitz. He jumps off a train on his way to Auschwitz when he's finally rounded up, and he ends up in the United States, and he becomes he starts a yeshiva, and he becomes a very, very influential anti-Zionist figure, and he blames the Zionist Jews, basically the secular Jews, for betraying the Jews of Europe. And so this myth still circulates to this day. It's actually unfair. The Zionists, David Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, and others, once they found out that there was a chance to rescue Jews, they actually ended up agreeing, even though it was illegal, even though it would have contravened the Trading of the Enemy Act. The Zionists did step up. They did provide very crucial funds in these ransom efforts. And yet there's this myth that persists that the Zionists turned their back on the Jews because they didn't support this. It's very complicated. None of this is black and white. Breaking the law and helping the Nazis extend the war effort. People have been very controversial after needless to say.
Right.
So it's not easy, but again, like I said, the Orthodox believe saving a life takes precedence over everything else. The answer
I find a few very interesting things to what you said. First of all, the, as you called it, Unholy Alliance, which is actually so inspiring because, when it comes to saving life, we should be above politics. We should be above particularism, tribalism, and ideological divides. I mean, as you put it so beautifully, that principle, that drive, that motivation to really break every boundary, including the law itself, comes from Judaism, comes from our heritage, from our tradition that says there was nothing that stands before saving life. So I find that to be fascinating. I also find it very fascinating, and thank you for providing such a balanced perspective, that actually this is a story that is intentionally ignored, if I understood you correctly, by certain segments because of the heroes being of a particular religious persuasion. But to go back even further, it seems to me like we have also pinpointed the Sternbach cable for setting off all of the future action. That is to say, this became the first-hand report that reached the shores of America and exposed the horrors of the Holocaust to the Jewish community. So it's incredible, really, to go back to this, a woman who, as you put it, was a housewife. And yes, you're right. Typically, her role would have been domestic and raising her children, etc. And she turns into this extraordinary heroine, which is amazing and really deeply inspiring. We have a few minutes left, 5 or so minutes. So I wanted to jump into a few questions. First of all, I'm curious to know if you brought the story to Steven Spielberg himself. If he's aware of the story, I would think it's the type of story that's worthy of the silver screen. I mean, we're all familiar with his work on Schindler's List, which was an incredible telling of the Holocaust to the wider world. But with all due respect to Oskar Schindler, who of course initially started off as more commercially minded, etc. Maybe similar to Mizo, I think it was his name, the former Swiss president. Here in this case, you're talking about a woman saving hundreds, or being instrumental, I think you put it, and it's very true. We shouldn't exaggerate, but was instrumental in the saving of hundreds of thousands of lives. And it's an extraordinary story of entrepreneurship, of creativity, of thinking out of the box, of breaking boundaries, of being willing even to collaborate with the enemy to protect and save life. So have you brought the story to Stephen? I'm not sure if you have a direct connection to him. And beyond that, is this being brought to the silver screen? Has this script been bought by any of the film houses, and is this going to be developed into a movie?
It's in the process of being optioned for a film, not by Steven Spielberg, unfortunately. That would be nice. Although the Shoah Project did feature this in their newsletter, but it's important. A lot of people watching this and hearing this story probably are asking themselves, why hasn't this story ever been told before? Why don't we know about this? And there's a couple of answers. I did mention this idea of the Orthodox rule being ignored, but it goes beyond that. This is very controversial. This idea of collaborating with Nazis. And so for years and years, so Rezo Kastner gets assassinated in Israel for his role in this, and a lot of people do not want to talk about these things. Now, you're all familiar probably with Ken Livingstone, the former Labour leader, the former mayor of Greater London Authority. He brings up, I know you're embroiled in your own controversy over the Labour Party and anti-Semitism, etc. And this plays into this because Livingston a few years ago brings up a pact, this early pact, the transfer agreement made famous by Edwin Black's book about the Havara, this agreement between early Zionists in Palestine to get Jewish capital out of Germany. So it was a pact between Germany and Zionists. And this was a rescue effort. Edwin Black calls it the first Holocaust rescue effort. It was fairly important rescue effort. And yet Livingston and other anti-Semites, for anti-Semitic reasons, I guess they're trying to link it to Zionism somehow. But they've linked this to make it seem as if, like, look, Jews willing to even collaborate with Nazis. So that became a dominant narrative and very controversial. Nobody wanted to talk about this stuff. Nobody wanted to talk about these efforts to reach out to Nazis. In fact, there were some, I wouldn't call them heroic Nazis. Now, Himmler, it's really important to stress, Himmler never had a change of heart. Himmler never felt guilty about what he had done to the Jews. He was deceived. That's the incredible thing about this whole story. The Rasha Sternberg, Jean-Marie Musi, the Allied intelligence deceived Himmler into suspending the final solution, into freeing Jews, into turning against Hitler, because he believed. To the very end, he believed in this separate peace. That's how elaborate and successful the deception was. But he never had a change of heart. And yet there were some Nazi figures who did help in these negotiations and who were sympathetic. And so nobody likes to talk about that. But more importantly, I always believed, as I was telling this story, that it would be very controversial because it might be used by Holocaust deniers. There's always that danger that Holocaust deniers will take the story and point to Himmler's role. Look, Himmler ended the final solution. Himmler wasn't one of the greatest villains of all time. He saved a couple of 100,000 Jews. And so there was always that danger. So there's all kinds of behind the scenes issues with telling the story. And I believe it's why it was never pursued before. Certainly they had ignored these Orthodox archives because they dismiss the Orthodox role, but it goes beyond that.
That's fascinating. Let me ask you an interesting question. I'm curious to know, have you been in touch with the family? Like, what ended up happening to Resha? How was she recognized by the Jewish community, by the state of Israel? Was Measley recognized as one of the righteous Gentiles? And some of the others, the police chief who lost his job. Could you tell us a little about the characters and what ended up happening to them, including Resha and her family in particular?
So Resha, yeah, I mean, one of Resha's daughters is alive and was very cooperative. Her niece, who was an eyewitness to these negotiations, actually was very helpful in this. But Resha dies in 1969 of cancer. Resha and Isaac both die in the 60s. And the interesting thing about Resha is she never, ever talked about this. Sometimes people would arrive at the Sternbach household in Switzerland after the war, and they would tell the family that their mother had saved them from the Holocaust. And sometimes this would happen 3 times in 1 week, where people would just arrive at the door wanting to thank Sternbach. So the children had never heard these stories. They were quite young when it happened. They remember giving up their beds to Jewish refugees before the war, but they were never really aware of how significant their both parents. It's not just Resha. Isaac was also very instrumental, and Eli, the brother-in-law, but Resha was the key player, and she would never talk about this. There's all kinds of incredible stories that at one point she marches into a Nazi battalion over the border in Germany, and she demands that they release. She's heard that they've rounded up these Jews and are going to deport them to a concentration camp, but she demands the release. The SS officer, she's face to face with him, and she demands in the name of the Jewish people that he release her. And she could have been arrested and sent to a concentration camp. And she was a Swiss citizen, but so she was sort of safe. But all these incredible stories start to emerge, and the family hears about them, and they'd ask Resha about this, and they'd want to hear the stories, and she'd always answer the same way. She wouldn't give any details. All she would say is, "I didn't do enough." So to her dying day, she knew she had saved huge amounts, but it paled in comparison. In her mind, it paled in comparison to the 6 million who ended up dying.
It's so poignant. It brings to mind the scene with Oscar Schindler, played by Liam Neeson, where he takes that pin and he says, "I could have saved one more Jew. And he who saves one life is as if they save a world entire." But once again, Max, just to go back to it, this is the story of heroism. It's a thriller. What you're describing here is superhuman, superwoman heroics of the highest order. Yeah. Going across the border. She was arrested and she faced trial for this. I mean, I cannot wait to see the story on the big screen, Max. I wonder whether there are any other books about this. In the book, do you include all the details that you're alluding to? And finally,
much more.
And how has her family reacted to the book?
Oh,
and once again,
they're happy that she's getting that recognition. They've come to some of my talks in New York. In Brooklyn, the Sternbucks are very well known. There have been some books by Orthodox historians or Orthodox writers that talk about Resha Sternbach, but they've never really received recognition. So they were very happy. I didn't know how they'd receive me, a secular Jew, in Borough Park in Brooklyn, in the enclave of Orthodox Judaism. But they're thrilled that the story is being told by a secular Jew to a wider audience.
Max, I just want to jump in for a second. I can't hold myself back as a Chabad rabbi, and I've written a book about this too with Chabad philosophy. To the Lubavitcher Rebbe, there was no such thing as a secular Jew or a religious Jew. He would say those are all labels. Right. Those are all labels. We're all Jews. We're all brothers and sisters. We're part of a family.
And that's what Resha would always say. Resha would always say, a Yid is a Yid. And she never distinguished between saving Orthodox or saving secular Jews, or even Gentiles.
I have to tell you something, Max. It's stories like this that make me wish I met someone like Resha and her husband and her brother-in-law. And the utter humility and the utter really trauma and devastation that comes through, if only I could have saved more, is truly heart-wrenching. And it's a very beautiful story. It's a ray of sunshine and redemption in an otherwise incredibly bleak and gloomy period of history, because the truth be told, while this is a silver lining, the cloud was overcast. If you talk about Churchill and Roosevelt blocking this effort, and I'm sure they had political considerations, and that's true. But here we were talking about saving 1 million lives.
Right.
And it's surprising to me. I wonder if you could share just a minute about what was the mindset of Churchill and Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, we know, was more political, I think, about this. He only entered the war when America was attacked.
Right.
But Churchill seems to be, at least to my mind, the real hero of World War II, because he was a principal. This was all about decency. This is all about democracy and the protection of our of freedom. And I wonder what his consideration and his mindset was as to why he vetoed that what you call trucks for blood. I mean, 1,000 trucks. What's 1,000 trucks in the grander scheme of things? What's 400 tractors in the grander scheme of things?
Right. Well, it's interesting. Churchill is a complex figure in all this, because on the one hand, they really did, the Allies, all of us, owe so much to Stalin. Stalin won the war for the Allies, and they knew it, right? So they were not willing to throw Stalin under the bus. We know that Churchill had a premonition of how Stalin was going to emerge as a villain after the war, and yet there was still that recognition and gratitude for what Stalin had done to save everybody against Hitler. So I believe, you see it. I'm reading the documents as they're happening in real time, and you really see the mindset. Churchill has a transatlantic telephone conversation in 1945. So I talked about the night of Hitler's birthday. There's this meeting between the World Jewish Congress representative Norbert Messer from Sweden and Himmler, where Himmler Messer convinces Himmler to countermand Hitler's final order to dynamite all the remaining concentration camps. So Himmler leaves this meeting around 5 a.m, and he heads to the headquarters of the Red Cross, the Swedish Red Cross figure, Count Bernadotte. And this is just after he met with a Jew inside Germany on the night of Hitler's birthday. This was treason. And so he approaches Bernadotte, who believes that he's just asking him about this Red Cross evacuation that was happening of the Scandinavian prisoners. And he tells Bernadotte that he asks him if he has access to Eisenhower. And Bernadotte is surprised. Why? He wants to offer a German surrender on the Western Front. So he was willing to surrender to the Western Allies, but not against Stalin. And Bernadotte is surprised and perplexed, but he relays the story. He relays the request. And so I have a transcript of the conversation between Churchill and the new American president, Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt died not long before. And they're discussing the terms of this. The war is about to end. It's only a matter of time, a week or two before Germany surrenders. And they're still very steadfast, even on this call, that they demand unconditional surrender. So at this point, Himmler still believes the deception has been so complete and so successful that he still believes that the West is somehow going to welcome him into the fight against Stalin. And Churchill and Truman are absolutely steadfast, nothing but an unconditional surrender on all fronts. So that's what's going on in Churchill's mind. But to give Churchill some credit, we all know about the bombing of the Auschwitz train tracks, which was actually called for by the Sternbucks as well. The Sternbucks relayed the request to bomb the train tracks. They never asked to bomb Auschwitz. It was to bomb the train tracks so that the trains from Hungary couldn't get to Auschwitz, to the death camp, to extermination. So Churchill actually okays it. Churchill wants to bomb the train tracks and gives his approval. Anthony Eden also is in favor, and it's Roosevelt that ends up vetoing it and claims that they need this, the planes for the war effort, which is a very dubious excuse. So to be fair, Churchill ends up, having some compassion at the end. That Roosevelt, we don't really see Roosevelt.
Wow. Listen, Max, you have shared with us a real incredible story that's little known and should be very well known, and hopefully will be so through your book and through the film that's going to be made, please God. And once again, I think it talks to the power of the individual, really and truly the individual. Monumental change is not often or not always initiated by a large, governmental machine, as it were. Here's a woman with determination and willpower who, through her charm and charisma and sheer willpower, galvanizes an entire network of people from across all spectrums, faiths, backgrounds, etc. And ultimately, it seems, activates their compassion, their humanity, and does so with extraordinary results in hindsight, regardless of her own misgivings and
That's
her
a
own.
great way of putting it. She activated their compassion. I absolutely agree. That's exactly what she did.
Yeah. We don't have the time now, but we'll read more in the book. I'm sure you add what happened to Measley and how he went through a change. Clearly, he was initially motivated by his clients, but then it seems he went all out to save people. I just finished an amazing book. I'm assuming you read it, about a British intelligence officer, Foley, who saved 10,000 Jews or so. An incredible man. So in conclusion, I want to thank you for telling this story. Are you working on any further Holocaust stories that you are able to share with us?
I'm actually working now on a biography about Helen Keller, of all people, and the political crusades of Helen Keller, who very few people realize that she was one of the most prominent socialists of the 20th century. And the reason I chose this topic is Helen Keller. I did my book about Henry Ford and his anti-Semitic crusade and his Nazi affiliations, and I discovered that Helen Keller was one of the most prominent figures opposing anti-Semitism and convincing the U.S. government to turn against Henry Ford and stop him in his tracks. And then when I was researching this book, I discovered, doing a lot of research into the Nazis' activities after they took power in Germany, and we all know that the Nazis burned books. And of course, they burned books by the usual suspects, who people we'd expect, like Freud, Einstein. So one of the books I encounter, they're burning a book by Helen Keller, and the book is How I Became a Socialist. So Helen Keller hears that the Nazis have been burning her book, and she becomes a crusader, an absolute crusader, to convince the New York Times. She's shocked that the New York Times are not more strongly opposing Hitler and highlighting the atrocities of the Nazis. And so Helen Keller is devoting herself early on to eliminating the scourge of anti-Semitism, and later on the scourge of Nazism, which is this fascinating figure. And
that is fascinating.
Not just focusing on the Jewish angle. I mean, I wrote a book about Muhammad Ali, as we mentioned, and his battle against the war. And I discovered, of all people, Muhammad Ali, this devout Muslim, became a very close friend to the Jews and had this incredible affinity with the Jewish community, because when he was traveling early on as a boxer, before he was famous, he was traveling from town to town to town. He'd already converted to Islam, and he needed halal. He could only eat halal food. And of course, Muslims are allowed to eat kosher. Jews are not allowed to eat halal, but Muslims can eat kosher. So he ended up in all these Jewish restaurants where the Jews welcomed him with open arms. So he had this affinity for Jews. And then later on, I discovered this incredible story about how he's in a Bronx hotel room, and he watches on the news a community center in the Bronx is going to be closed because they're $500,000 in debt. And it's a refuge for Holocaust survivors in New York. It's this lifeline, this community lifeline for Holocaust survivors. So he watches this. He he's still not, he hasn't had his license reinstated. He doesn't have any money. He calls up his business manager and asks him to send a check to save this center. And the business manager who told me the story says, "Champ, you don't have that kind of money. We can't write a check." And he says, "Get it. My next fight, I'm fighting again. The purse will cover it." So he calls up the Chase Manhattan Bank and gets a certified check delivered to this community center, which still exists to this day, because Muhammad Ali had this early affinity with the Jewish people, right? So
That's an awesome story. That is wild. Did he continue to develop that relationship?
oh, absolutely. I mean, a lot of his strong allies, when everybody else had abandoned him, were Jews, and he never forgot that. I mean, Howard Cosell was Jewish, of course, right? First major figure would actually call him Muhammad Ali instead of Cassius Clay, and he absolutely rejected, and most importantly, he spoke out very publicly against Louis Farrakhan. Twice, very publicly, came out against Louis Farrakhan's anti-Semitism, right? Which shocked a lot of his followers, including his own brother. His own brother is still a follower of Farrakhan. So Ali had no hesitation. The leader of his former sect, the Nation of Islam, he slammed him for anti-Semitism specifically, right? So it all goes back, as far as I can see, and Ali told me this personally, that this early affinity with Jews. Jews were the only white people that would welcome him with open arms in a restaurant, right? So it all goes back to these little acts of kindness end up paying off.
That's a beautiful way to end tonight's discussion. And I would say that there is a common thread between all the topics, between all the characters, from Resha to Muhammad Ali to Helen Keller. These are people of integrity, people of principle, people of compassion, and people who were not silent bystanders. They used their power, their influence, their fame, their resources, their time. You know, a housewife, what did she have? And her husband's resources to go out there and save human life. So on that note, I want to encourage all of our viewers, we can all be heroes in our own environment, in our own neighborhood, in our own communities. Let us learn from this example. Let us grow and add and increase in our acts of goodness and kindness, what we refer to in the Jewish tradition as mitzvot. And let us develop and express and disseminate these precious values and bring healing and unity and compassion and love and solidarity to a world that is desperately in need of all of the above. And thank you so much, Max, for joining us from Canada. And we wish you every success in all of your endeavors. And I really hope and pray that your stories get much wider attention and that you personally have the strength to grow from strength to strength and continue shedding light and shining a light on acts of light.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rabbi. Thanks for having me.